Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. We are delighted to do another in our series of Zoom programs where the head judge of each of our 22 awards interviews the winners. Today we're showcasing the winners of the Edward R. Murrow Award, and the head judge is one of our governors, Vivienne Walt, who lives in Paris, writing for Time and Fortune. And one of the panelists, Rukmini Callimachi, is a former governor and has won numerous OPC awards, including when she was at AP, when she won 2 awards in 1 year, which only happens in once every few decades. Another has also won two awards and a citation. And so we're delighted to have everyone who participated in Collision that was on the New York Times, the weekly, participate in this discussion. Just a couple logistical issues. Vivienne will interview the winners for about half an hour, then we'll open it up to questions, and you can either put your questions in the chat or you can raise your hand. And if you wish to ask the question yourself, we can unmute you when you're called on. So with that, I turn it over to Vivienne. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patty. So thank you everybody for joining. And aside from Rukmini, we're delighted here to have Singeli Agnew, who was the producer on this incredibly moving, poignant documentary, and who has produced numerous documentaries for what was the New York Times Weekly, The Weekly, on Hulu and FX, and which is now the New York Times Presents in its second reiteration this season, which has just begun. Hopefully there'll be some great entries in next year's OPC awards as well. And we have Jeff O'Brien, who has edited a number of these documentaries and who is joining us from New York. And Singeli is joining us from DC. Thank you, everybody. And I guess I would like to start off with a question which really struck me looking at the documentary and reading Rukmini's story, which I remember so well when it came out. At what point did you know this was going to be video and print? And how do you begin to prepare for something that, you know, presumably began as a kind of print idea, and suddenly you're making a documentary with all the attendant issues that go along with that?
Thank you, Vivienne. I wrote the print story soon after the ISIS attack in July of 2019 that killed these 2 Americans, Lauren Gagan and Jay Austin. And I did an initial story just about the ISIS claim of the attack. And in the course of doing that story, I discovered the blog and the Instagram posts that this young couple had left behind. And I really, to be honest, I just fell in love with them. They were such remarkable people. And, you know, we're in the habit of saying that whenever somebody is killed in a tragic way, you know, that they were remarkable. But I've covered a lot of terrorist attacks. And what struck me about Lauren and Jay is that the values that they embodied, the values of opening their heart to the world, you know, of believing in the goodness of others, of putting themselves in a vulnerable position as bikers, you know, showing up in areas that they'd never been to, and just hoping for the kindness of strangers. Everything that they believed in was, in a way, the diametrical opposite of what ISIS stands for. And so I went back to my editors and I said, you know, we often don't do enough stories about the victims of these terrorist attacks. I think that these two people are truly unique and truly remarkable. Let's do something just about them. So we did a second print story that was essentially their biography based on the very rich material that they had left behind. And at the same time, this new documentary program, The Weekly, was being launched at the New York Times. And when I was approached and asked if I had any ideas for this new documentary, I pointed out that this was incredibly visually rich. And that was, I think, the germ of it. But then, of course, all of the work that my colleague Singeli did to get us to Tajikistan, which is a country that does not give out journalist visas easily. I believe the last time that a Times reporter was there was at least a decade before, if not longer. And where in general, journalists are not allowed to report without minders. And we, to our knowledge, did not have a minder in the period that we were there. That is, I think, what took it to the next step.
I would just add that I think for the film, it was really in the balance until we got that visa. We kind of knew that we wouldn't have enough to see until we were there on the ground. And, you know, it was a difficult process to get that. It took months to get the visa, multiple trips to the embassy. And so we really weren't sure we could make it until we got that access.
Now, I mean, as you point out, this is a very closed off country. And, you know, those of us who are old enough to remember this, a number of journalists went through there on their way to Afghanistan after 9/11. And I think that's probably the last time we got a window into this country. I was really struck and curious as to what do you think was in it for the government to give you this kind of access, which was really quite extraordinary. What did they have to get out of that?
You know, Singeli and I were talking about it last night. I think in the end, we don't know for sure why we were given this access, because what's interesting is they gave us our visa at a point in time that coincided with the opening of this major dam. And they wanted us very much to cover that dam. And so when we showed up there were several other TV crews and journalists who had been brought in specifically for the dam ceremony. I think that it helped us that we went to see the Tajik ambassador in DC multiple times and made completely clear what we wanted to do. We were never, I mean, this is just kind of the way the New York Times operates, but we made very clear, we are doing a story about ISIS. We believe that ISIS killed these people, which is not the Tajik narrative. The Tajik narrative was that it was an opposition party that killed the cyclists. I am an expert on this terrorist group, and I'd like to go there to be able to look at the evidence myself. We later learned when we did go, they wanted us very much to go to the opening of the dam. So we went to the opening of the dam along with these other reporters, and we spoke to the other reporters and learned that several of them had essentially petitioned to come to Tajikistan hoping to do other stories, but with the excuse of covering the dam. So they had taken the opposite tact. And all of those reporters that we ran into at the dam ceremony had minders, including one crew, this one woman, she and I decided to go to the ladies' room together. And the minder literally followed us to the ladies' room and stood outside, the porta potty, because we were out in the middle of this, this construction site while we came back. So I think part of it was that this was a moment where they were bringing in reporters and they wanted us to cover this, but what is not explained in that is why they seemed to give us free rein and we were allowed to go where we wanted. And as far as we could tell, there was not somebody following us. The second level of access that we got was a result of a relationship that we were able to strike up with one of the lead investigators. And by just some chance, some stroke of luck, the lead investigator had listened to my podcast, Caliphate, and had loved it. So he knew of me, and he wanted basically to, I think, show off his investigation, which actually had been quite thorough. You would not expect, in this totalitarian state, whose leaders were pushing out this completely cockamamie theory that the opposition party, had killed these people and had engineered this ISIS, claim, etc. his investigation very clearly showed the ISIS link. They had encrypted channels that they had gotten chats from, showing the messaging between ISIS and the killers. They had found the ISIS flag. They had interviewed, Hussein, who was the survivor of the raid to arrest them. And I think part of it was a pride in wanting to show me and others that he had done this right. So I think that was what got us access internally. I am still puzzled by the fact that they gave us access to Hussein Abdusamadov. We're the only international crew that was able to go and do an interview with the lead organizer. And that happened after our trip. We had, Singeli and I went there for, I think, roughly 2 weeks, or maybe less than 2 weeks. We had asked repeatedly for that interview. We hadn't gotten it. We went back to New York. And very soon after we got back to New York, they came back and said, you can come back and interview him. And I went back with Victor Tadashi, just by myself, to do basically a one-day interview with him.
I see. So, and I have to say, the fact, and you make this quite clear in the documentary, the fact that you had so much primary source material was really, I think, maybe almost unique in any kind of terror attack that we had. We have the text messages, we have, video of the victims the very night before they killed. And here you have the prison interview. I mean, I'm just thinking, I'm sitting in Paris, where of course many people have been killed in terror attacks, and Rukmini, you yourself covered this. And of course there was no one left to interview. They were all killed, effectively.
Right.
So here you have the lead guy, the lead ISIS operative. You describe in the documentary that I think the word you used was complicated. That doing prison interviews is a complicated thing for us journalists, ethically, legally, on all sorts of levels.
Yes.
How uneasy were you during that interview, and are there things you came away with feeling, maybe less than 100% okay with?
Because I cover ISIS, I've come to the conclusion that these primary interviews with members of the terrorist group are pretty much the most valuable tool that you have as far as a window into this entity. People assume that these terrorists just lie to you. Some do, but once in a while, and much more often than you would expect, you get real information from them, information that you can then that you can cross-reference with documents that you have gotten, with internal paperwork from the terrorist group. And that was very much what I feel I came away with from the Hussein interview. It bears noting that at several points in the Hussein interview, he would parrot this line, which was the government's line. He would explain to me how this was ISIS, and then out of the blue he would say something like, and this was actually organized by the opposition party by so and so, and his tone of voice would change, his eye movements would change. It felt clear to me that he was saying that because he felt he had to. That was the most indication I had of some form of coercion on his behalf. But there were also moments in the interview where it was clear to me that he had agency. There were questions he didn't want to answer. After some time, he got tired of the interview and asked for it to be over. And so I think the complexity with the situation is that many of these prisoners in Tajikistan, in Iraq, in Syria, are held in places that most likely do not uphold the standards of human rights. And so the question becomes, do they have free will, in this interview? Do they have a chance to say no? And that adds definitely a complication. But as somebody who's trying to learn about this group, once you're offered that interview, what are your choices? Your choice is to say, no, I'm not going to do it because of these complications, or I'm going to go and listen and decide whether this information is at some level valuable. And I think that we spent a lot of time thinking about it. And, I interviewed him for, I think, 3 hours. We didn't have by any means, the room or the appetite really to go into the enormous amount of detail that he shared about his involvement with ISIS. But he walked me through the battalions that he joined once he was in Syria. He talked about the specific battlefields he was at, battlefields that I happen to know quite well because I was there covering the liberation, of those cities. And it was clear to me that he was speaking about an authentic experience. There was just way too much detail, about where he was in the city of Tal Afar in Iraq on this date, where he was in this place in Syria on that date, which I know corresponds with when ISIS was there. So I felt like we came away with something meaningful. And of course, like Singeli and others, I'm troubled to hear that he recently died in jail.
Yes, I would just add one thing is that he, it was after he'd been sentenced as well. And that was quite an important point, is that when we were there the first time, the trial was still ongoing. And it was after his sentencing that we were able to speak to him, which is a factor, I think, in weighing all of these decisions.
Just before we go on, I just wanted to mention that Patty, forgive me if I'm interrupting the flow of things here, but that people, as they have questions, can write them down in the chat box, and we will be getting to them in a little while. So Rukmini, yeah, we were completely stunned to see that he had died in jail. Actually, it coincided exactly when we voted on the documentary as the winner. We don't know anything about the circumstances that he died in. Is it likely that somebody wanted him dead?
It's possible. Tajikistan. So the death of Jay and Lauren and two others who were killed at that attack in July of 2019 is the first time that ISIS carried out a successful attack in Tajikistan, claimed it through their propaganda channel. But since then, there have been numerous prison riots and attacks within the prisons that ISIS has claimed, and that according to our sources are credibly ISIS, are members of, are Tajik members of the terrorist group that have returned to the country, that got arrested, and that are now causing these upheavals in jail. We got some information from some of our colleagues in Tajikistan that Hussein might have been involved in coordinating some of those uprisings. So there might have been, he was probably, an uncomfortable entity for the security forces. But I have to stress that I don't know for sure what happened. We don't have visibility on that. Singeli, what would you add?
I mean, the official narrative is that he had kidney pain and had an infection and died of this ailment. And I think the general, Tajikistan has been for years rated sort of lowest on the list of press freedom indices. But I think the general assumption is that there was some sort of foul play amongst, there's a skepticism, but no one has any evidence of that we are in touch with. So it's hard to say, but these things, everyone, has their suspicions.
So in fact, your prison interview is actually the last public word we will ever hear from Hussein. So just before we leave that, Rukmini, during the scene of you sitting in prison with him, it seemed almost like it was sort of a personal quest for you. I mean, you asked him things like, what do you see when you look at me? Do you see a human being? And perhaps the most emotionally charged moment of the documentary is when you showed him a photograph of Jay and Lauren and said, what were you thinking killing these innocent young people? Firstly, was it a kind of quest to finally come face to face with, an ISIS murderer and be able to ask him the questions you hadn't been able to ask in so many other attacks. And what was the emotion of that moment when he kind of looked away, almost like he couldn't bear to look you in the eye?
Vivienne, like I said, I've by now interviewed dozens of ISIS members, the majority of them in jails, in Iraq, in Syria, in Europe, in Tajikistan. And what's interesting is once they are in that setting, so they're facing the brunt of the law, they divide themselves into two categories. Those who, in the face of what they are now looking at, which which is a life sentence, or in the case of Iraq and Syria, the possibility of a death sentence, some of them lose their commitment, to this group, and they'll say things to you like, "Oh, I was brainwashed. Oh, I didn't understand. Oh, I made a mistake." And then the real hardliners, which in a way, I have to say, I hope that this doesn't come out wrong, but I have some respect for them, for those who in that moment, like Hussein, stick to their guns and say, this is what I believe in, this is why I did it, and I'm not backing down from that. And that's what Hussein did. He told me multiple times in that interview that if he could kill these beautiful young people again, he would do it again. I tried to push him and say, you are doing this because, in a sense, you're against American foreign policy. You see Americans as having killed innocent Muslims in other parts of the world. But are you aware that Jay and Lauren are agree with you? They are critics of this American foreign policy. These are not people who agree with America's forays into these other lands. That was the one moment when I saw him back off a tiny bit, where he said, "Oh, I didn't know that," and then he immediately comes back and goes, "But I would still do it again." And I tried to personalize it by saying to him, "Look, I'm sitting here with you now. I have no ill will towards you, but if you were to meet me in the same situation that you met Jay and Lauren, would you kill me?" And he said, "Yes, I would. Yes, I would." So there was a level of integrity, I think, there, that this man that by the pictures we saw immediately after his arrest had clearly been beaten. Now we know that he's died under these suspicious circumstances, and yet in spite of all that, he maintained this murderous ideology that he believed in. And so that, as a journalist, made me feel like I was in the face of something quite authentic. And journalistically, I found that meaningful and important.
Couldn't you share with us any updates about the families of those who were killed? I mean, it's not that long ago. It was only a little more than a year ago. And the documentary must have been pretty wrenching, I would have thought, for them. How do they view it now? What have they, how have they tried to capture the legacy of their children? Yeah,
I'd like to first acknowledge some of the family members of Jay and Lauren, who I think are on this call now. And I can't imagine the pain that they are dealing with. I was on maternity leave when this film came out. I was actually pregnant in Tajikistan when we were filming, and I've been a journalist for decades now. I've covered these kinds of losses over and over again, and I think intellectually I understood what losing a child must mean. But there's a completely different awareness of that now that I am a mother myself. And I happened to be in California on maternity leave when the Hulu documentary was going to air. And I knew that Lauren's family lived in California. And so I asked permission to come see them a couple of days before, and I actually went with my son, with my baby, specifically so that I could tell them that, that I thought I understood, what you're going through. I still don't, but I cannot imagine the pain that you're going through now. And I have to say that, especially Lauren Gagan's family, they are just light, like I don't know how people who are dealing with something so horrible are able to not express hatred towards the people who did this. They have created a number of scholarships in Lauren's name at her high school at Georgetown, where she was a university student. There's talk of possibly creating something for Tajik students. And so they're, in the midst of this indescribable pain, they are trying to do good. And I find that quite remarkable.
I found it amazing that the night before they were killed, when they slept, they camped on some farmland in a village, in a nearby village, that they had written a note to the farmer. Now, moments like this, obviously, you can't script when you go out and do reporting in the field. Were you kind of amazed to stumble across what seemed like just, one gem after the other when you got on the ground and started to report and started to film?
I mean, yes, I thought that Singeli, be sure to jump in here too as well. I could not believe just the amount of documentary richness, that came across. And I think that also speaks to who this young couple was. One of Lauren's friends had this quote that went into my print story, which was where she said, Lauren was not just a good person. She was a person that was exceptionally good at connecting with others in a way that I think would have been exhausting for myself and for anybody else. And this comes through where, they're on a bike ride around the world. They're staying at these campsites for not very long, but time and again, we would run into people who had this fleeting interaction with them and yet were somehow touched by them. Like this farmer who couldn't even speak their language and had kept this piece of paper that they had written. I recognized their handwriting, where they had just written him basically a thank you note to say, thank you for hosting us in your orchard the night before they died.
The other thing, and Singeli, maybe you can jump in here as well. The other thing that struck me watching this movie was what came through from a lot of the Tajiks was they were kind of furious at these attacks, and that they felt like all their attempts to kind of join the world community had just been kind of, trampled on.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a real culture of hospitality in Tajikistan. It's one of the defining characteristics of the country. And it was actually, the year that this happened, it was the year of the tourist. They had made it was a big year for them to open the country up to tourism, and was something that they were quite proud of. And so it was a huge blow. And I think each Tajik that we met, so many, were really, had a personal agenda to make sure that, the world knew that they didn't approve of what had happened and were just furious. Yeah, so that's, I think, was just really, we felt that everywhere we went.
When we met the Tajik ambassador in Washington, what struck me is that over and over again, he said to Singeli and I am so sorry. I apologize for what happened. I am so sorry. And it was this, it wasn't this passive, we are sorry. It was, I am sorry. It was really quite moving. And we found this with Tajiks of all stations in life, where they felt personally aggrieved, personally hurt by the loss of Jay and Lauren. And yeah, for a small country, that was sad to see.
The memorial that they erected on the side of the road where the attack happened, every time we were there, Tajiks would stop and sort of visit it and, you know, say a prayer or do some sort of, you know, there was dozens that would stop there every hour we were there.
Rukmini, I was also struck by your interview with his mother, with Hussein's mother, who I was a little confused, actually. Do you think that she was aware of, you know, what her son had become? She seemed a little bit in denial of who he was.
So she talks about how he was essentially her most talented child. You know, he spoke English. He actually spoke quite fluent English, as well as Russian and Tajik. It's interesting because he didn't want to conduct the interview in English. He wanted to do it in Tajik, but he clearly understood the questions I was asking. And at a certain point, he leaves and goes to Russia. And that seems to be the path of a lot of Tajiks that end up getting radicalized. They join the immigrant community in Russia. They're living in dormitories together. And from there is the movement to Syria. So her account is that she had not seen him in some time. She's his mom, you know, like I don't know if she's in denial or if she just doesn't want to tell me. But it was just a sad interview, you know, to speak to a mom about a child that has gone on to do this.
Just we're going to take one question, which has come in from Hendrik Hensel, about, he's saying he's not sure about the timeline of when the article came out and where the bulk of the research took place. Was it from the US or on the ground? And did you need to revisit some of the print reporting once you'd done the documentary, or was that all done afterwards? And I think back to the question I had originally of how did you merge this research with the production?
So Jay and Lauren are killed in July of 2019. Sorry, in July of 2018. And I believe my first print story was a day or so after they were killed, when ISIS claims it through their official propaganda. And then my big feature on them was August 7th of 2018. So essentially within a week, you know, of their death. We then go to Tajikistan. Singeli, help me out. It was around Thanksgiving, right? So it was November or October, November of 2018.
It was October, but I would say in that period of time when we were waiting on a visa, I hired a Tajik speaking researcher in New York, and we were, I mean, because Rukmini's reporting was the incident and then largely on the life of Jay and Lauren. And what we didn't know is anything about the attackers and who they were.
Right.
You know, that information had not come out. And I hired a researcher in New York who spoke Tajik and helped us sift through the social media profiles of the attackers and all their contacts. And so it was this exhaustive weeks-long process where I was working with, you know, someone who could read basically the Tajik equivalent of Facebook, and sort of find these breadcrumbs that we were chasing in order to know which town we needed to go to, and piece together who could take us to the various regions. So it was, you know, it was weeks of work. And then once we got into Tajikistan, of course, that opens up a whole another layer of avenues. But a lot of the work was done, I would say, in between the print article and our deployment.
Yeah. And then I think we were in Tajikistan October, November, a little bit end of October, beginning of November, and then we came back for Thanksgiving, and then I went back to interview Hussein, I think first week of December, if that's not right, if that's not incorrect, or maybe end of November.
Late November, yep.
Late November, and then it ran when my son was roughly a month and a half. So that was what, in May or June of 2019. Does that sound right? Yeah.
The
Anyway,
joys
it
of
basically
television cycles.
that's right. It ran much later, and no, I never went back and rehashed the print article. There was nothing inaccurate about the print article. It was just that we discovered a lot more that became the bulk of the movie.
I have a hand raised from Bill Holstein, and can somebody unmute him so he can ask his question? Hi, Bill, you there? Sorry, I'm having trouble.
Chad, can you unmute Bill, please?
I think I just did it.
Oh,
Did I do
Okay,
it?
all right, good.
hi, Bill. You're on.
Yeah. Hi, Vivienne. Pleasure to meet you, Singeli, on the visually, and Rukmini, good to see you again as well.
Hi, Bill.
Rukmini, my question is, these were remnants of Islamic State that were there in Tajikistan. Are they scattered throughout the region? Does Islamic State, you're one of the world's experts on Islamic State, do they have a chance to reconstitute themselves from these perches, these holds they have in different countries? Or you say they're still communicating with each other on channels. What is the state of play with them at this moment?
Thank you for that question, Bill. I mean, I feel like I'm getting like hoarse by saying this over and over again, which is that ISIS is not dead, despite what the U.S. government keeps on saying about it. ISIS has not been defeated. It has not even been, in my opinion, meaningfully degraded compared to where it was, a couple of years ago. They are reconstituting very much in Iraq and Syria. If you look at the rate of attacks, the attacks are increasing. They have an ever-growing footprint in Africa, especially in West Africa, also in the Congo. And more recently, we're seeing attacks as far afield as Mozambique that we believe are being commanded by the affiliate in the Congo. And the former Soviet republics, they don't get enough attention in terms of ISIS's influence there. But there was a series of studies and data that was collected by Ali Soufan's group. Ali Soufan is a former FBI special agent and now runs an intelligence gathering firm. Initially, in the first wave of reporting about ISIS in 2014, 2015, the thought was that the bulk of their recruits were coming from North Africa, Tunisia, those kind of places. And in fact, the Soufan group did a report a couple of years later that debunked that and showed that the bulk of the recruits were coming from the former Soviet states, not just Russia, the Chechen area, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and that was a real important group. And you actually see it in ISIS's leadership ranks. The former Minister of Defense of ISIS was from one of these countries, and that is what Hussein was drawing from. There were 5 attackers in Tajikistan. Of the 5, we believe that only Hussein traveled to Syria and fought with the group in Syria. He then told us that he was deployed to go carry out an attack, and that he tried to get to Europe, couldn't get into Europe, cooled his heels in Turkey for some time, and then got instructions to go back to his home country and look for the infidel there, which by definition means tourists. And that's how they landed on these young cyclists who were going on what had become a quite popular cycling route through the country. I should add that Tajikistan is achingly beautiful as a country. If it's quite sad because they were just starting to have more and more of a tourism industry, and it was specifically because people were going to cycle through this beautiful route that Jay and Lauren were also going on.
Amazing. So, Rukmini, I had a question about your current reporting and how it all links up.
I have a question about that too, Vivienne. I'm not sure how it all links up either.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, no, for those of us who read the New York Times, it's become noticeable that you have turned your focus to police killings in the US. Why the shift in focus, and are they kind of like lessons that you've drawn from, you know, everything you've been through the last few years to what you're now thrust into as a reporter?
So the week of the lockdown on the East Coast, and I was living in New Jersey. That very Sunday, I was supposed to get on a flight to Africa to do a story on ISIS, and literally a few hours before my flight, Uganda, which was one of the countries that I was transiting through, announced that Americans would have to go through a mandatory 2-week quarantine. So needless to say, I never got on that flight. And then for weeks on end, I found myself, you know, just kind of stuck at home, like so many of us, you know, trying to figure out how in the world do I do my beat from home. This is not a beat. ISIS is not a beat where you call people on the phone. My terrorist sources are not people that you contact that way. And so for a while, I was just kind of trying to find my way. I was sort of flailing and not sure what to do. And then this moment in American history began, this reckoning for racial justice. And I was asked by my newspaper if I could contribute to that. So that's what I'm doing for now. I am very eager to get back to ISIS because, as I mentioned to Bill, I don't think it's over. And I think it's exactly in this kind of moment where we're turning our eye away from it that it becomes dangerous.
I see a question for Jeff. Is that from you, Patty?
Yes, it's from me. So, Jeff, well, first of all, I have to say congratulations for the Times winning the Edward R. Murrow Award, which of course traditionally has been a broadcast award that the newspaper has. Well, Rukmini's won the award for podcast and now for a documentary. And you mentioned that the weekly is now called New York Times Presents. Could you say a little bit about why that change was made and how you choose which stories you're going to focus on?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, to do the second part first, the process hasn't changed on how the stories get chosen. I think, you know, the mechanism is still the same, which is we still figure out which is the most documentary rich sort of subject and go from there. And as to why we sort of shifted, it was more of we needed to slow down. We were forced to slow down because of a lot of the circumstances that were going on, and so we weren't able to create the stories at the speed at which we moved before. And you know, with like what Rukmini was just working on recently, is that we wanted to sort of just dig in deep on some of these and allow for, at least from what I had heard a lot of times, is people wanted to know more about these and wanted them to be longer if possible. And so we decided that we would take the time to slow down and make longer pieces, but make longer pieces when possible. And that takes more time.
We would have loved to have an hour on this one. We could have filled it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm interested to hear about all the material that didn't make it into the Tajikistan documentary. So just to follow what Jeff was saying, you know, it is extraordinary that it's really quite recent that the New York Times was a print publication. I mean, it was really only a few years ago that when you spoke about the New York Times, you were actually speaking about the newspaper. And I am curious to know, and maybe each of you could just talk briefly about this. How have your lives as journalists at the New York Times changed as the company is clearly becoming a media company. It is no longer a newspaper company.
Should I take that one?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
So I've had the privilege of being able to tell stories in 3 mediums, I guess now. So print, which is my home, my motherland, let's say, audio through the podcast I did for Caliphate and others, and now the visual medium. And what I remind myself is, because of course it's sort of these are very different, mediums, but the way that you do journalism doesn't change. The way that you have to verify information, the type of ethical relationships that you build with sources, the way that you interact with officials in a way that speaks to the integrity of your newspaper, none of that changes. You're still doing it the same way. And in the end, the real tools of investigative journalism, that is still the mechanism through which you get the story, regardless of which medium it goes into. What I am more aware of is, for example, on Breonna Taylor, this is the young African-American woman who was killed in a police shooting in her own home here in Kentucky, which is where I am now. We told that in all 3. We had a print story, we had a 2-part audio podcast, and we also had a video that Jeff was involved with editing. And so for the print story, it's a standard reconstruction of both her life, the actions of the police, what went wrong that night, the missteps, etc. That was the classical presentation. But I knew right away that there was going to be something for our audio colleagues to work with, because there was so much rich audio. There were the 911 calls. So I've learned to think sort of other raw material rather than just the way I would normally shape a story. There were 911 calls from Breonna's boyfriend who watched her die, next to him, and who was calling the operator, sobbing on the phone, asking for help. There's the 911 calls from the neighbors who have no idea what's going on. There's then audio of the main police officer who opens fire and who is shot first by Breonna Taylor's boyfriend. And he gives a more than hour-long deposition, really, to the police investigative unit. And we had that audio. And then there are jailhouse phone calls. Anyway, there was an enormous amount of rich material for the ear that was quite different in a way than what I had mined in the print story. So that created the space for that. And then there's video. And if you were just to read on the page Tamika Palmer's quotes, this is the mother of the young woman, the quotes don't look like much. It's when you hear the enormous pain in her voice. There's information I've learned that is encoded in different ways, in just the sound of somebody's voice, or in the visual of somebody speaking, where you understand, from the expression, from the facial movements, from the movements of her hands, you understand something more about that person's experience. And so we were able to do it in all 3 formats.
Singeli and Jeff, I mean, do you find yourself within the New York Times having to, or being called upon to, kind of advise print reporters about how to, go into a story, go into interviews, thinking about, how to film them, how to record them, how, gathering material that's in front of them, not just with a pen and paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a very different way of thinking and way of approaching an interview specifically, because you have to always be thinking about what you need the subject to say, really. So it's less about information that can happen off camera, and it's more about sort of a holistic sort of expression of what this scene needs to say. It's everything gets so condensed in a film. I mean, you can't write. I think one of the things we really struggled with early on with the weekly is sort of overwriting, over narrating, because essentially it was like trying to turn a print article into film, and that doesn't work. So I think a big part of the process was like learning to take, you know, helping the Times sort of learn to take the narration out. And so, yeah, I think it's a lot of my job as a filmmaker was to sort of help make that jump from print to something that worked on film, that really carried the story narratively and visually.
And
Yeah,
Jeff,
and I just wanted to say real quick, and just going off of that, I wanted to say, like, and oftentimes, making sure that, the people's words that they're saying, and like listening to the space in between the words, and making sure that they had that space. Or you referenced the look that Hussein gives after Rukmini asked the question, like making sure that makes it into the piece is like, well, that, that's that look is just as important as the words. So, and making sure that comes through.
So, if one were to walk into the New York Times newsroom now, does print still occupy prime position then there in the big newsroom, or is it much more of a mix now? And are people sitting? Is video, audio? Are these like different areas of the New York Times, very different areas of the newsroom? Or are things much more integrated at this point?
Well, Vivienne, I don't think any of us have stepped into the New York Times newsroom since March. This is my perspective, and maybe my colleagues disagree, but I do think that print is still the main business, of the New York Times. And by print, I don't mean the print paper, but I mean the written story. That is still the main thing that is discussed at the page one meeting, etc. But at the same time, the audio division has grown in leaps and bounds. Back when we were doing Caliphate, I think they had 6 or 7 employees, and now they have several dozen. And same with the video element. But I'm curious to hear what Jeff and Singeli think about that.
Yeah, Jeff, since you're in New York, I'm curious, how do you see it? Or do you feel like an adjunct to what's to the, the real business at hand at the New York Times, or?
Everything, we're all still very siloed into what we're doing. Like, I don't really have visuals on what else happens over there. So it's hard for me to even say. We are knee deep in the New York Times Presents every day. It's hard to say what else is even happening for me, from my perspective.
I think the reporting is central, but there's a real acknowledgement of the power of film, and in this day and age, that the Times has really embraced that. But the reporting is still central.
Patty, I'm not sure how much time we have left still.
We can. There don't seem to be any more questions. We're free to bring it to a close now, or if you have a couple more, we have a few more minutes.
Sure. Well, I guess I do have a final question for the three of you, and that is, how has the pandemic changed things for your reporting? And clearly you couldn't have gone to Tajikistan at this point. But are there a whole lot of things that are not being done and not being reported because of the pandemic? Rukmini, what would you say?
I would say that might be on the war on terrorism, and on the problem of terrorism has suffered, because for the longest time, I don't think that Iraq was even open. Syria, the border crossing into Syria, as far as I know, is not open. So I couldn't even physically go, to the places that have fed that beat. At the same time, I think that the pandemic and the social upheaval that's happening in America right now really is one of the biggest topics, and it's and the looming election and what's going to happen with that, and whether the election results are going to be accepted, are, I think, very important questions, and so therefore I'm grateful that I'm able to contribute to that recording.
And how about from the visual team here? Jeff and Singeli, how much are you able to do? How much are you basically just feeling unable to do?
I feel like I've been busier since February than I've been in years, actually. I covered the pandemic, and it's just everything takes longer, there's a lot more steps in keeping everyone safe. But I covered COVID in New York. I went to Brazil and covered COVID. I've now been doing a project more about just domestic unrest. But we've been getting out there, and it's all takes more time and a lot more steps and care. But it's been a very intense time reporting wise for me, and I feel like it's just everywhere you turn, there's stuff to report on. And I think there have been cases. I mean, with Tajikistan, for instance, it's been very tough. I mean, again, for a country that already suffered with reporter freedom. It's been very tough to get in and out for anyone, and information to get in and out. But I think there's stories everywhere for us to look at.
Anything to add, Jeff?
No, I mean, these guys kind of hit on it, from a production standpoint. Like she said, things just take a little bit longer, and you got to get more creative. Unfortunately, I'm working on a story now that's based out in LA, so we're dealing with COVID and fires. And the story has nothing to do with either of those, but we have to, taking those into account,
Yeah. On the Breonna Taylor film here in Kentucky, one of the rules that the production side imposed is that all of our interviews had to be filmed outdoors. So I mean, that comes with its own challenges, like we're looking, there's only so many parks you can go to, that don't start looking the same, so we have a team that is constantly scoping out parks and looking for new, fresh locations so that every interview doesn't look like we just put, the same person up against the same tree. But yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. This has really, really been an interesting conversation. And congratulations once again on the Collision documentary. It's fantastic. I watched it a few days ago after not having seen it for several months, and it was still as emotionally charged and powerful as ever, and great work.
Thank you, Vivienne.
Thank you.
Thank you, OPC.
Yes, thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, Vivienne, for
Thanks,
a very
Vivienne,
interesting program. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.